grubby legislation from a grubby little government.
Holly Walker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, Mr Speaker, I'm sure it will come as no surprise to you or to anyone else in this House that the Green Party is very proud to stand opposed to this detestable legislation to lower the minimum wage for young people in New Zealand. And as the party responsible for the legislation that removed youth rates in 2008, we are rightly proud in the Green Party of our track record of standing up in this Parliament against discrimination, against driving down wages to subsidise big business, and standing up for young people and their right to a good life and a fair future, including fair employment conditions and fair pay. And Mr Speaker, the reintroduction of youth rates for 18 and 19-year-olds and the unjustified extension of the training period for 16 and 17-year-old workers in this bill is a massive step backwards. We've already heard from some of our Labour colleagues some of the compelling arguments against the reintroduction of youth rates. But I thought, Mr Speaker, why just listen to the opposition on this? Why should we rely only to the arguments on this side of the House when there are plenty of government MPs who've put the case against youth rates incredibly well themselves when the House last considered this issue 2 years ago? And I thought perhaps we should hear from one of them, David Bennett, who spoke earlier in this debate. And he actually has given one of the best speeches against youth rates that I've ever seen. And I quote, "The fundamental proposition this bill puts up is that we need to pay people less to get them their first job so that they can have an unskilled future. That is what this bill essentially will do to New Zealanders." I'm still quoting. "We see a different future for New Zealanders. We want those young people to get into training and skills so that they are not talking about getting the lowest paid job they possibly can, but instead are looking to get the best paid job they possibly can. If we can achieve that, we can make the dynamic change in our economic base that will give New Zealand the growth potential we need." Still quoting, talking about the ACT Party who introduced the last legislation, "I think that is the fundamental point that the ACT Party has not grasped. It is looking at things in a historical perspective. Well, the world has moved on." That was David Bennett, Mr Speaker, in 2010. And he's right, the world has moved on. Now, I want to quote another government member, one who I've got a lot of respect for actually, Dr Jackie Blue, in the same debate. "National has not seen any evidence to show that young people are losing their jobs because of youth rates. We are not convinced that this bill will reduce youth unemployment. We should be focused on growing the economy and providing opportunities and jobs for young workers." And that was Jackie Blue in 2010. So, Mr Speaker, that's why the government members oppose youth rates, and I'll leave it to them to explain, if they can, without tying themselves into rhetorical knots, what's changed since they made those statements. But at the heart of the Green Party's opposition to this legislation is the issue of discrimination. Mr Speaker, I would imagine that there is not one member of this House who would today stand up and say that we should have a lower minimum wage for women than we do for men in order to make it easier and help them find work. And I would imagine that not one member of this House would stand up today and say that we should have a lower minimum wage for Māori than we do for non-Māori to make it easier for them to get into work. Some of them might think it, but I don't think there is one member in this House who would get up and say it because it is ethically, legally, morally and politically repugnant to this House and to New Zealanders. Now, we used to hear those exact arguments. We've rehearsed them in this Parliament. But thanks to some very brave and courageous and passionate people who stood up and argued for what was right, we have finished those debates and we have moved on. Ours is a society that understands and accepts and agrees that sexual and racial discrimination in employment is not acceptable. And Mr Speaker, I thought that we had taken another step forward in 2008 when we abolished age discrimination in the workplace by removing youth rates. And so did David Bennett, obviously, when he told the ACT Party in 2010 that the world had moved on. But apparently some members of the House are living in the past and they want to take New Zealand backwards. Mr Speaker, it's no longer acceptable to argue for sexist and racist employment policies, and it should be equally unacceptable to discriminate against young workers. And let's remember here that we are talking about young people who are doing the same jobs, the same work as their older counterparts. These are people who are employed to do exactly the same jobs as somebody else who's older than them, but who will be paid 20% less for doing that same job because of their age. It has been illegal to pay men and women different rates for doing the same job since 1972 under the Equal Pay Act, and it should remain illegal to pay young people differently for doing exactly the same job as older people. Their work is worth the same, Mr. Speaker. They are equally valuable as employees. And really, as far as I'm concerned, the argument should go no further than that. We reject illegal discrimination in New Zealand. That should be the end of the story. But unfortunately, we have a government that is pretty relaxed about discrimination and even willing to overturn the views of its own members just a few short years ago to take us back down the path of youth rates, and they're using the economy as an excuse. So let's have a look at some of the economic arguments, and I start first with the regulatory impact statement prepared by the Department of Labour, which gives you a flavour of just how much intellectual rigour has gone into the formation of this policy. Now, the officials note that the Ministry has not considered any other options for achieving the objectives of the proposed starting out wage package. And the reason that they didn't look at any other options is because it was a pre-election policy commitment. So the analysis has focused primarily on how to implement decisions that have already been signalled by the government. No analysis of whether they're actually a good idea, no analysis of whether there might be better ways to achieve the problem of addressing youth unemployment. It was a preordained conclusion, Mr. Speaker. And the regulatory impact statement also notes that the consultation on the proposal has been limited. The Ministry has not consulted with external groups such as the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions or even Business New Zealand, Mr. Speaker, and that the analysis had been constrained by the relatively short period of time in which they were given to undertake the analysis. So there you go, that's the intellectual rigour, that's the economic analysis behind this proposal. It was a preordained conclusion, Mr. Speaker, with pretty much no basis. But what we do know from the unrelenting and unpalatable rhetoric from this side of the House, the government side of the House, is that the government has an unrelenting focus on work, and it wants to see young people off welfare and into work or training. We know this, we've heard it time and time again. So the solution, you would imagine, if you wanted to get young people off work and into training, would be to create jobs and training opportunities for young people. But that is not what this government has done. Oh no, they have decided instead to give businesses a massive subsidy in the form of absurdly low wages in an attempt to make young people more attractive to employers. So how are they going to do that? Well, it's easy. They've made young people incredibly cheap to employ. On the poisonous starting wage of $10.80, it makes young people very cheap indeed to employ. And they can pay them, they can employ them for 3 months and pay them $10.80. And then what are they going to do after that? Well, that's easy too, because they have a 90-day trial period they can take advantage of. Another attack on young workers by this government. And so they can simply replace them with another cheap young person on $10.80 an hour. Now, as Kay Brereton from the Beneficiary Advocacy Federation of New Zealand has pointed out, the result of this is going to be that taxpayers end up subsidising young people's low wages. And instead of creating new jobs, employers are going to have an incentive to churn through young employees to keep the wage bills low. So they won't be creating new jobs, but in fact they'll be creating the same job every 400 hours or every 6 months, whichever comes first, over and over again. Mr. Speaker, as this government so eloquently argued in 2010, the solution to youth unemployment is not to scapegoat young workers. It's not to pay them less or to discriminate against them and worsen their prospects. The solution is education, skills training and job creation. But what kind of incentive is it to pay young people, including independent 18 and 19-year-olds, so little? Mr. Speaker, every young New Zealander deserves a good life and a fair future, but you can't have a good life on $10.80 an hour. You just can't. And you can't have a fair future when you're discriminated against from the moment you enter paid work. So that brighter future that this government is so fond of referring to is clearly not intended for young people.
Jamie Lee Ross.
Mr. Speaker, Andrew Little